Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Welcome to Wednesday. We're almost done with April. And I got something in the mail today. We don't get mail very often, mostly because we do not have a PO box. And not putting my address up on the thingy where everybody can see it, because safety and security and all that other stuff. But we got this from Miss Crazy Crafter again. We're going to do a little shout out. We're going to open the envelope. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. The shout out goes to our friends. I suppose I gave it away, didn't I? Let's see who it is today. It's Miss Crazy Crafter. It's Miss Addie. Hold on. Okay. So first thing we have here is this. Thank you so much for coming into my lives and watching my videos. My family is coming to South Dakota in October. Hopefully I will get to meet with you while I'm there. Have a great week. Your friend Addie. Miss Addie, just let us know when you're in the area. We will do our best to meet up with you. Advance notification is helpful, but my job is pretty flexible. So just let us know when you're in the area. October, we do have an idea for Joe and I's anniversary. So, depending upon when you're in the area, that could be a thing. Anyway, on to the next piece here. Hold on a second. All right. So this says Happy Mother's Day. This is very beautiful. I'd send it to my mom, but no, we're not that close. Maybe Joe's mom. We'll see. Hold on a second. Okay. Now we open this up. And then it says, to your own kind of beauty. Oh, that's nice. I like that. Beauty is one of those things, is like, as I say, in the eye of the beholder. And of course, she was nice enough to include an envelope. So, with Miss Addie, she does cards and other paper art. Her cards are wonderful and beautiful, and very interesting. So check her out. Like, share, comment, pop into her lives, where she makes these beautiful cards. And now you get to listen to Joe ramble about war. I'm sorry, Miss Addie, you ended up on a war video. I have to go find pictures. Have a good day. All right, Mr. Man, late. Tell him something interesting.
Well, let's talk about war, shall we?
No.
War is a fun topic.
War's silly.
War is something we always get to deal with.
That is true.
Because guess what? History is usually mostly about wars. But,
unfortunately.
Yeah. We have a fun one that dates, well, basically the start of it.
The start of what? The world?
The start of the war.
Which war?
The Spanish-American War.
Oh, that one.
Yeah. Now, originally, it was dealing with the fact that the Spanish-American War was fought between Spain and the United States in 1898. Kind of got an ignominious start with the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana, and resulted in the U.S. getting some sovereignty over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and they established what's known as a protectorate over Cuba. Represented the U.S. intervention in the Cuban War of Independence and the Philippine Revolution, and later leading to the Philippine-American War. Well, the Spanish-American War would bring an end to almost 4 centuries a Spanish presence in the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific.
Wow.
The U.S., meanwhile, not only became a major world power, but also gained several island possessions spanning the globe, which provoked rancorous debate over the wisdom of expansionism. How dare you take and grow?
No.
Of course, we don't want to, look at England or anything with all their, states and stuff, or, France or those guys, Belgians. But, anyway, the big thing that kind of predates this, and it's kind of funny because they actually retroactively declared war back to the 21st of April. But Spain actually declared war on the United States first, which makes me kind of giggle. Now, what would wind up happening to start this whole fun thing off was the combined problems that were coming off of the Peninsular War. That was 1807 to 1814, the loss of most of its colonies in the Americas during the 19th century Spanish-American Wars of Independence, and three Carlist Wars, 1832 to 1876, marked a low point for the Spanish colonialism. They were having their own problems. Liberal Spanish elites like Antonio Canvaros del Castillo and Emilio Castelar offered new interpretations of the concept of empire to dovetail with the emerging Spanish nationalism. Canovas made clear in an address to the University of Madrid in 1882 his view of the Spanish nation as based on shared cultural and linguistic elements on both sides of the Atlantic that tied Spain's territories together. Well, Canovas saw Spanish colonialism as more benevolent than that of other European colonial powers. The prevalent opinion in Spain before the war regarded the spreading of civilization and Christianity as Spain's main objective and contribution to the New World. The concept of cultural unity bestowed special significance on Cuba, which had been Spanish for almost 400 years and was used as an integral part of the Spanish nation. This focus on preserving the empire would have negative consequences for Spain's national pride in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. Now, in 1823, the fifth American president, James Monroe, enunciated the Monroe Doctrine, which states that the United States would not tolerate further efforts by European governments to retake or expand their colonial holdings in the Americas. There's a great little cartoon that says, "Hands off the Americas." You see Uncle Sam, show him the hand. To retake or expand their colonial holdings in America, or to interfere with newly independent states in the hemisphere. The U.S. would, however, respect the status of existing European colonies. Before the American Civil War, 1861-1865, Southern interests attempted to have the United States purchase Cuba and convert it into a new slave state. Oh. The pro-slavery element proposed the Ostend Manifesto in 1854, and anti-slavery forces rejected it. Oh, why?
What?
Well, after the Civil War and Cuba's 10 Years' War, the U.S. businessmen began monopolizing the devalued sugar markets in Cuba. In 1894, 90% of Cuba's total exports went to us in the U.S.,
Yay!
Which also provided 40% of Cuba's imports. The Cuban total exports to the U.S. were almost 12 times larger than the export to Spain. The U.S. business interests indicated that while Spain still held political authority over Cuba, it was the U.S. that held economic power over Cuba.
Cool.
Well, you're that close. I mean, hello. Straight from Hawaii. Straight from Florida, right across the little bay. The U.S. became interested in a trans-isthmus canal. And this was kind of interesting because they did think about one in Nicaragua or Panama, and they realized the need for naval protection. Captain Alfred Sayre Mahan was an exceptionally influential theorist His ideas were much admired by a future president, Mr. Theodore Roosevelt, as the U.S. rapidly built a powerful naval fleet of steel warships in the 1880s and 1890s. Roosevelt served as an Assistant Secretary of the Navy from 1897 to 1898 and was an aggressive supporter of the American war with Spain over Cuban interests. Meanwhile, the Cuba Libre movement, led by Cuban intellectual Jose Marti, until he died in 1895, had established offices in Florida. The face of the Cuban Revolution in the U.S. was Cuban junta under the leadership of Thomas Estrada Palma, who in 1902 became Cuba's first president. The junta dealt with the leading newspapers and Washington officials and held fundraising events all across the U.S. It funded and smuggled weapons. It mounted an extensive propaganda campaign that generated enormous popular support in the U.S. in favor of the Cubans, and Protestant churches and most Democrats were supportive, but business interests called on Washington to negotiate a settlement and avoid war.
No.
You know, we don't want to lose any more lives.
Why would we avoid war?
I don't know. So make it a bloodless coup. You know. But Cuba attracted enormous American attention, but almost no discussion involved the other Spanish colonies of Puerto Rico, also in the Caribbean, or of the Philippines or Guam. Now, historians note that there were no popular demand in the United States for an overseas colonial empire. Well, the first serious bid for Cuban independence was the 10 Years' War, which erupted in 1868 and was subdued by the authorities a decade later. Neither the fighting nor the reforms in the Pacte of Zajon in February of 1878 quelled the desire for some revolutionaries for wider autonomy and ultimately independence. One such revolutionary, Jose Marti, continued to promote Cuban financial and political freedom in exile. In early 1895, after years of organizing, Marti launched a three-pronged invasion of the island. The plan called for one group from Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, led by Maximo Gomez, one group from Costa Rica, led by Antonio Maceo Rajales, and another from the United States, preemptively thwarted by U.S. officials in Florida, to land in different places on the island and provoke an uprising. With their call for revolution, the Grito de Bar was successful. The result was not the grand show of force Marti had expected. With the quick victory effectively lost, the revolutionaries settled in to fight a protracted guerrilla campaign. How dare they do anything fast-paced?
No.
Now, Antonio Cavones de Castillo, the architect of Spain's Restoration Constitution and Prime Minister at the time, ordered General Arsenio Martinez Campos, a distinguished veteran of the war against the previous uprising in Cuba, to quell the revolt. Campos' reluctance to accept his new assignment and the method of containing the revolt in the province of Oriente earned him criticism in the Spanish press. The mounting pressure forced Canovoas to replace General Campos with General Valeriano Weyler, a soldier who had experience in quelling rebellions in overseas provinces and the Spanish metropole. Weyler deprived the insurgency of weaponry, supplies, and assistance by ordering the residents of some Cuban districts to move to reconcentration areas near the military headquarters. This strategy was effective in slowing the spread of the rebellion, and in the United States, this fueled the fire of anti-Spanish propaganda. In a political speech, President William McKinley used this to ram Spanish actions against armed rebels. He even said that this was not civilized warfare, but extermination.
Ooh.
Oh, ugly.
How extreme.
Yes. Now, Spain depended on Cuba for prestige and trade and used it as a training ground for its army. Spanish Prime Minister Antonio Canovoas de Castillo announced that the Spanish nation is disposed to sacrifice to the last peseta of its treasure and to the last drop of blood of the Spaniard before consenting that anyone snatch it even one piece of its territory. He had long
We're all going to die before we surrender.
Pretty much.
I kind of understand, but also kind of just like, dudes.
It almost sounds
What's
like...
the point of winning if you don't survive?
Yeah, it almost reminds you of what the Japanese were like in World War II. Now, he long dominated and stabilized the Spanish politics. He was assassinated in 1897 by an Italian anarchist, Michel Iglilio, leaving a Spanish political system that was not stable and could not risk a blow to its prestige. Well, the eruption of the Cuban revolt, with Weyler's measures and the popular fury these events whipped up, proved to be a boon to the newspaper industry in New York City. Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World and William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal recognized the potential for great headlines and stories that would sell copies. Both papers denounced Spain but had little influence outside New York. American opinion generally saw Spain as a hopelessly backward power that was unable to deal fairly with Cuba. American Catholics were divided before the war, but supported it enthusiastically once it started. The U.S. had important economic interests that were being harmed by these prolonged conflicts and the deepening uncertainty about Cuba's future. Shipping firms had relied heavily on trade with Cuba, now suffered losses as the conflict continued unresolved. These firms pressed Congress and McKinley to seek an end to the revolt. Other American business concerns, specifically those that invested in Cuban sugar, looked to the Spanish to restore order. Hey, guys, your island's got problems over here? Don't ask us how it happened. Innocent, stability, not war, was the goal of both interests. Stability would be achieved would largely depend on the ability of Spain and the U.S. to work out their issues diplomatically.
No.
Oh, yeah. Well, Lieutenant Commander Charles Train in 1894, in his preparatory notes to the outlook of an armed conflict with Spain and the United States, wrote that Cuba was entirely dependent on the outside world for food supplies, coal, and maritime supplies, and that Spain would not be able to resupply a naval expeditionary force locally. While tensions increased among the Cuban and Spanish government, popular support of intervention also began to spring up in the United States. Many Americans likened the Spanish Revolt to the American Revolution, and they viewed the Spanish government as a tyrannical oppressor. Historian Luis Perez notes that the proposition of war in behalf of Cuban independence took hold immediately and held on thereafter. Such was the sense of the public mood. Many poems and songs were written in the United States to express support of the Cuba Libre movement. At the same time, many African Americans, facing growing racial discrimination and the increasing retardation of the civil rights, wanted to take part in this war. They saw it as a way to advance the cause of equality, service to the country, hopefully helping to gain political and public respect among the wider population. President McKinley, well aware of the political complexity surrounding the conflict, wanted to end the revolt peacefully. He began to negotiate with the Spanish government, hoping the talks would dampen yellow journalism in the United States and soften support for the war with Spain. An attempt was made to negotiate peace before McKinley took office. However, the Spanish refused to take part in the negotiations. In 1897, McKinley appointed Stewart L. Woodford as the new minister to Spain, who again offered to negotiate a peace. In October of 1897, the Spanish government refused the United States offer to negotiate between the Spanish and the Cubans, but promised the United States it would give Cuba more autonomy. However, with the election of a more liberal Spanish government in November, Spain began to change its policies in Cuba. First, the new Spanish government told the United States that it was willing to offer a change in the reconcentration policies if the Cuban rebels agreed to a cessation of hostilities. This time, the rebels would refuse the terms in hopes that continued conflict would lead to U.S. intervention in the creation of an independent Cuba. The liberal Spanish government also recalled the Spanish Governor General Valeriano Weyler from Cuba. This action alarmed many Cubans loyal to Spain. Well, the Cubans loyal to Weyler began planning large demonstrations to take back when the next Governor General, Ramon Blanco, arrived in Cuba. U.S. Consul Fitzhugh Lee learned of these plans and sent a request to the U.S. State Department, hey guys, to send a U.S. warship to Cuba. This request led to the armored cruiser, the USS Maine, to be sent to Cuba. While the Maine was docked in the Havana harbor, a spontaneous explosion would sink the ship.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Sinking of the Maine was blamed on the Spanish and made the possibility of negotiated peace very slim. Throughout the negotiation process, the major European powers, especially Britain, France, and Russia, generally supported the American position and urged Spain to give in. Spain repeatedly promised specific reforms that would pacify Cuba, but failed to deliver, and eventually American patience ran out.
Let's make promises we're not going to keep.
Exactly.
Oh, cool. I know that game.
Yeah, what a concept. Now, when McKinley sent the USS Maine to Havana to ensure the safety of American citizens' interests and to underscore the urgent need for reform, naval forces were moved into position to attack simultaneously on several fronts if war was not avoided. As the Maine left Florida, a large part of the North Atlantic Squadron was also moved to Key West and the Gulf of Mexico. Others were also moved just off the shore of Lisbon, and others were moved to Hong Kong. Hi, Lisbon.
Hello.
1940 p.m., February 15th, 1898, the Maine sank in the harbor after a massive explosion. I remember there were several debates on this, whether it was a mine, whether a boiler had blown up inside the ship. All they know is 1 minute it was there, the next minute it was sinking into the harbor.
Goodbye.
Now, more than 3/4 of the ship's crew, 355 sailors, officers, and marines, died as a result of the explosion. Of the 94 survivors, only 16 were uninjured. In total, 260 servicemen were killed in the initial explosion, and 6 more died shortly thereafter from injuries, marking the greatest loss of life for the American military in a single day since the defeat at Little Bighorn 21 years earlier.
Wow.
Yeah. While McKinley urged patience and did not declare that Spain had caused the explosion, the deaths of hundreds of American sailors held the public's attention. McKinley asked Congress to appropriate $50 million for defense, and Congress unanimously obliged. Most American...
They agreed on something?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
But most American leaders believe that the cause of the explosion was unknown. Still, public attention was now riveted on the situation, and Spain could not find a diplomatic solution to avoid war. Well, I'm sorry your ship blew up, but,
Yeah.
Spain appealed to the European powers, most of whom advised it to accept the U.S. conditions for Cuba in order to avoid war. Germany urged the United Europeans stand against the United States, but took no action. Well, the U.S. Navy's investigation, made public on March 28th, concluded that the ship's powder magazines were ignited when an external explosion was set off under the ship's hull. The report pulled fuel on the popular indignation in the U.S., making war virtually inevitable. Spain's investigation came to the opposite conclusion. The explosion originated within the ship. Other investigations in later years came to various contradictory conclusions, but had no bearing on the coming of the war. In 1974, Admiral Hyman George Rickover had his staff look at the documents and decided that there was an internal explosion. A study commissioned by National Geographic magazine in 1999, using AME computing models, reported by examining the bottom plating of the ship how it bent and folded, AME concluded that the destruction could have been caused by a mine.
Huh.
Yeah. After the mine was destroyed, the New York City newspaper publishers Hearst and Pulitzer decided that Spain was to blame, and they publicized the theory as fact in their papers. Even prior to the explosion, both had published sensationalistic accounts of atrocities committed by the Spanish in Cuba. Headlines such as Spanish murderers were commonplace in the newspapers. Following the explosion, this tone was escalated with the headline, "Remember the Maine to hell with Spain," quickly appearing. The press exaggerated when it happened and how the Spanish were treating the Cuban prisoners. The stories were based on factual accounts, but most of the times the articles published were embellished. Gee, would newspapers do such a thing?
How dare you even suggest that they would embellish?
Yeah.
It's not like they're writers or creative peoples in any. They only print the truth.
Right.
Their truth, but that's beside the point.
Exactly. Not talking anything about publishing yours, but
how dare you?
Yeah. Well, they were written with incendiary language, causing emotional and often heated responses among readers. A common myth falsely states that when illustrator Frederick Remington said there was no war brewing in Cuba, Hearst responded, "You furnished the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." However, this new yellow journalism was common outside of New York City, and historians no longer considered the major force shaping the national mood. Public opinion nationwide did demand immediate action, overwhelming the efforts of President McKinley, Speaker of the House Thomas Brackett Reed, and the business community to find a negotiated solution. Wall Street, big business, high finance, and Main Street businesses across the country were vocally opposed to the war and demanded peace. After years of severe depression, the economic outlook for the domestic economy was suddenly bright again in 1897. However, the uncertainties of warfare posed a serious threat to full economic recovery. War would impede the march of prosperity and put the country back many years. This was warned by the New Jersey Trade Review, the leading railroad magazine, editorialized. From a commercial and mercenary standpoint, it seems particularly bitter that this war should come when the country had already suffered so much and so needed rest and peace. McKinley paid close attention to the strong anti-war consensus of the business community and strengthened his resolve to use diplomacy and negotiation rather than brute force to end the Spanish tyranny in Cuba. Historian Nick Kapur argues that McKinley's actions as he moved towards war were rooted not in various pressure groups, but in deeply held Victorian values, especially arbitration, pacifism, humanitarianism, and manly self-restraint. Now, a speech delivered by the Republican Senator Redfield Proctor of Vermont on March 17, 1898, thoroughly analyzed the situation and greatly strengthened the pro-war cause. Proctor concluded that the war was the only answer. Many of the business and religious communities, which had until then opposed war, switched sides, leaving McKinley and Speaker Reed almost alone in their resistance to a war. On April 11th, McKinley ended his resistance and asked Congress for authority to send American troops to Cuba to end the Civil War there, knowing that Congress would force a war. Now, April 19th, when Congress was considering joint resolutions supporting the Cuban independence, Republican Senator Henry M. Teller of Colorado proposed the Teller Amendment. This was to ensure that the U.S. would not establish permanent control over Cuba after the war. This amendment, disclaiming any intention to annex Cuba, would pass the Senate 42 to 35, pretty close. The House concurred the same day, a whopping 311 to 6. The amended resolution demanded Spanish withdrawal and authorized the president to use as much military force as he thought necessary to help Cuba gain independence from Spain. Now, President McKinley would sign the joint resolution on April 20th, 1898, and the ultimatum was sent to Spain. In response, Spain severed diplomatic relations with the United States on April the 21st, and on the same day, the U.S. Navy began a blockade of Cuba. On April the 23rd, Spain reacted to the blockade by declaring war on the U.S.
Whoops.
Well, on April 25th, the United States Congress responded in kind, declaring that the state of war between the U.S. and Spain had de facto existed since April 21st, the day of the blockade of Cuba had begun. It was the embodiment of the naval plan created by Lieutenant Commander Charles Treat 4 years ago, stating that once the U.S. enacted a proclamation of war against Spain, it would mobilize its North Atlantic Squadron to form an effective blockade in Havana, Manaus, and Sabra La Grande. Now, the Navy was ready, but the Army was not well prepared for this war and made radical changes in plans and quickly purchased supplies in the spring of 1898. The strength of the U.S. regular Army was just 24,593 soldiers. The Army wanted 50,000 new men, but received over 220,000 through volunteers and the mobilization of the state National Guard units, even gaining nearly 100,000 men on the first night after the explosion of the USS Maine. Kind of like remember the Alamo, or a couple decades later, Pearl Harbor. Everybody wanted to go join the war. Now, President McKinley issued 2 calls for volunteers. The first on April the 23rd, which he called for 125,000 men to enlist, followed by a second appeal for a further 75,000 volunteers. Now, states in the Northeast, Midwest, and the West quickly filled their volunteer quota. In response to the surplus influx of volunteers, several northern states had their quotas increased. Contrastingly, some southern states struggled to fulfill even the first mandated quota, namely Alabama, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. Well, that's one thing that's interesting up here. A lot of the cemeteries I've gone to, you'll see the headstones of Spanish-American War veterans.
Right, we have quite a few.
Oh, yeah.
Which is why when I saw that, I was like, well, we've seen a lot of those stones.
Yeah, patriotic. Now, the majority of states that did not allow African-American men to volunteer, which impeded recruitment in southern states, especially those with large African-American populations. Quota requirements based on total population were unmanageable, as they were disproportionate compared to the actual population permitted to volunteer. This was especially evident in some states like Kentucky and Mississippi, which accepted out-of-state volunteers to aid in meeting their quotas.
Isn't that cheating?
Just a little bit. Hey, you're from Texas? Come here.
You're close enough.
Yeah, you're Yankee over the border here. Now, the Southern's apprehension towards enlistment can also be attributed to a war weariness derived from the Confederacy's defeat in the Civil War. Many of the South were still recuperating financially after their losses in the Civil War, and the upcoming war did not provide much hope for economic prosperity in the South. The prospect of a naval war gave anxiety to those in the South, and the financial security of those working and living in the Cotton Belt relied heavily upon trade across the Atlantic and would be disrupted by a nautical war, the prospects of which fostered a reluctance to enlist. Potential volunteers were not financially incentivized, which, with pay per month initially being about $13, which then was raised to $15.60 for combat pay.
Woo!
And back then, that was actually quite a nice chunk of change.
Well, even now that's not too bad.
Yeah.
Of course, now it's hourly rather than weekly, but still.
Right. Now, it was more economically promising for more Southern men to continue their own enterprises rather than enlist. Now, the overwhelming consensus of observers in the 1890s and historians ever since is that an upsurge of humanitarian concern with the plight of Cubans was the main motivating force that caused the War of Spain in 1898. McKinley put it secondly in late 1897 that if Spain failed to resolve its crisis, the United States would see a duty imposed by our obligations to ourselves, to civilization and humanity, to intervene with force. Intervention in terms of negotiating a settlement proved impossible. Neither Spain nor the insurgents would agree. Luis Perez states, certainly the moralistic treatment of war in 1898 has been accorded preponderant explanatory weight in the historiography. By the 1950s, however, American political scientists began attacking the war as a mistake based on idealism, arguing that a better policy would have been realism. They discredited the idealism by suggesting that people were deliberately misled by propaganda and sensationalist yellow
No.
journalism. Political scientist Robert Osgood, writing in 1853, led the attack on American decision process as a confused mix of self-righteousness and genuine moral fervor in the form of a crusade and the combination of knight errantry and national self-assertiveness. Now, here's where I get to have my fun side because everybody likes to look at yellow journalism as the bad guy in this. Now, at the same time, you look at the opposite side of the coin. What was the other option that they had? People were getting butchered over there who were trying to fight for their independence. Spain wasn't doing jack. Are we just supposed to leave the island alone and, let the people get brutalized? It's kind of foolish, Osgood. Now, his argument that war to free Cuba from Spanish despotism, corruption, and cruelty, from the filth and disease and the barbarity of General Butcher Weiler's concentration camps, from the devastation of haciendas, the extermination of families, and the outraging of women, that would have been a blow for humanity and democracy. No one could doubt it if he believed, and skepticism was not popular. The exaggerations of the Cuban junta's propaganda and lurid distortions of the imaginative lies purveyed by yellow sheets of Hearst and Pulitzer's at the combined rate of 2 million newspaper copies a day.
Wow.
Now, again, they also do mention that was affecting a little tiny area called New York.
So that's a lot in that day and age.
Oh, yeah. But at the same time, if you can't read a copy of the New York Times down in Florida, it's not going to affect your opinion much.
Well, that's a detail.
Yeah.
Small detail. They can only do so much.
Yeah. And it says in his War and Empire, Professor Paul Atwood of the University of Massachusetts writes, the Spanish-American War was fomented on outright lies and trumped-up accusations against the intended enemy. War fever in the general population never reached a critical temperature until the accidental sinking of the Maine was deliberately and falsely attributed to Spanish villainy. In a cryptic message, Senator Lodge wrote that there may be an explosion any day in Cuba, which has sembled a great many things. We've got a battleship in the harbor of Havana, and our fleet, which overmatches anything the Spanish have, is massed at the Dry Tortugas. Also, in his autobiography, Theodore Roosevelt gave his views of the origins of the war. Our own direct interests were great because of the Cuban tobacco and sugar, and especially because of Cuba's relation to the projected Panama Canal. But even greater were our interests from the standpoint of humanity. It was our duty, even more from the standpoint of national honor than from the standpoint of national interest, to stop the devastation and destruction. Because of these considerations, I favored war. But this would basically be the point where it would all kick off, and obviously the Pacific Theater was a part of the segment because it involved the Philippines. The Philippines were actually ruled for 333 years.
Oh.
Nice even number. They developed from a small overseas colony governed by a Mexico-based viceroyalty of New Spain to a land with modern elements in the cities. The Spanish-speaking middle classes in the 19th century were mostly educated in the liberal ideas coming from Europe. Among these ilustrados were the Filipino national hero Jose Rizal, who demanded larger reforms from the Spanish authorities. Look, somebody else wants the Spanish to get their butts moving. This movement eventually led to the Philippine Revolution against Spanish colonial rule. The revolution had been a state of truce since the signing of the Pact of Biaknabato in 1897, with revolutionary leaders having accepted exile outside of the country. Well, Lieutenant Warren Kimball, staff intelligence officer with the Naval War College, prepared a plan for war with Spain, including the Philippines, on June the 1st, 1896, known as the Kimmel Plan. Well, on April the 23rd, 1898, a document from Governor General Basilio Agustin appeared in the Manila Gazette newspaper warning of the impending war and calling for Filipinos to participate on the side of Spain. Now, Roosevelt, who was at that time Assistant Secretary of the Navy, ordered Commodore George Dewey, commanding of the Asiatic Squadron of the United States Navy, ordered the squadron to Hong Kong, keep full of coal. In the event of the declaration of war with Spain, your duty will be to see that the Spanish squadron does not leave the Asiatic coast, and then offensive operations in the Philippines. Dewey's squadron departed on the 27th for the Philippines, reaching Manila Bay on the evening of April the 30th. Well, the first battle between American and Spanish forces was at Manila Bay, where on May 1st, Commodore Dewey, commanding the Asiatic Squadron aboard the USS Olympia, in a matter of hours defeated a Spanish squadron under Admiral Patricio Montejo. Dewey managed this with only 9 wounded. While the German seizure of Quindago in 1897, Dewey's squadron had become the only naval force in the Far East without a local base of its own and was beset with coal and ammunition problems. Despite these problems, the Asiatic Squadron destroyed the Spanish fleet and captured Manila's harbor. Look, guys, the harbor! Following Dewey's victory, Manila Bay became filled with warships from other naval powers. The German squadron of 8 ships, obstinately in Philippine waters to protect German interests, acted provocatively, cutting in front of the American ships, refusing to salute the American flag, according to customs and naval courtesy, taking soundings of the harbor and landing supplies for the besieged Spanish. With interests of their own, the Germans were eager to take advantage of whatever opportunities the conflict in the islands might afford. There was fear at the time that the islands would become a German possession. The Americans called Germany's bluff and threatened conflict if the aggression continued. The Germans would back down, and at the time, the Germans expected the confrontation in the Philippines to end in an American defeat, with the revolutionaries capturing Manila and leaving the Philippines ripe for German picking. The United States government had concerns about the self-government capability of the Filipinos, fearing that a power such as Germany or Japan might take control if the United States did not do so. Well, Governor Dewey transported Emilio Aguado, a Philippine leader who led rebellion against Spanish rule in the Philippines in 1896 from exile in Hong Kong, to the Philippines to rally more Filipinos against Spanish colonial government. By June the 9th, Aguado's forces controlled the provinces of Bukalanan, Cavite, Lugano, Bacaranas, Bataan, Zambales, Papagena, Papasan, and Mindoro, and had laid siege to Manila. On June the 12th, Aguado proclaimed the independence of the Philippines. While Aguado's revolutionary forces were fighting, preparations were underway in the U.S. to send land forces to supplement Dewey's naval forces. Troops began departing San Francisco on May the 25th and arrived in Manila on June the 30th, having officially formed the U.S. Army, the U.S. 8th Army Corps on June the 21st, while they were in transit. Look, guys, we're a corps. On August the 5th, upon instruction from Spain, Governor General Basilio Agustin turned over command of the Philippines to his deputy, Fermin Girondas. On August the 13th, with American commanders unaware that a peace protocol had been signed with Spain and the U.S. the previous day in Washington, D.C., American forces captured the city of Manila from the Spanish at the Battle of Manila. What do you mean we don't have to fight a war? We're in great peace, guys.
Yeah? I didn't get the memo.
No kidding. All those memos are always, a good month behind schedule sometimes. This battle marked the end of the Filipino-American collaboration and the American action of preventing Filipino forces from entering the captured city of Manila was deeply resented by the Filipinos. This later would lead to the Philippine-American War, which would prove more deadly and costly than the Spanish-American War. Like I said, they always seem to want to have a fight.
Fight!
Now, the U.S. had sent a force of some 11,000 ground troops to the Philippines, and on August the 14th, 1898, Spanish Captain General Jonas formally capitulated, and U.S. General Barrett formally accepted the surrender and declared the establishment of a U.S. military government in occupation. The capitulation document declared the surrender of the Philippine archipelago and set forth the mechanism for its physical accomplishment. That same day, the Sherman Commission recommended that the U.S. retain control of the Philippines, possibly granting independence in the future. On December the 10th, 1898, the Spanish government ceded the Philippines to the U.S. in the Treaty of Paris. Armed conflict broke out between the U.S. forces and the Filipinos when U.S. troops began to take the place of the Spanish in control of the country after the end of the war, quickly escalating into the Philippine-American War. Now, June 20th, 1898, the protected cruiser USS Charleston, commanded by General Henry Glass, and 3 transports were carrying troops to the Philippines entering Guam's Apia Harbor. Captain Glass had opened sealed orders instructing him to proceed to Guam and capture it while en route to the Philippines. Charleston would fire a few rounds at the abandoned Fort Santa Cruz without receiving return fire. 2 local officials, not knowing that war had been declared and believing the firing had been a salute, came out to the Charleston to apologize for the inability to return the salute as they were out of gunpowder. Oops. Glass would inform them that the U.S. and Spain were at war. The following day, Glass would send Lieutenant William Braunersruther, what a name, to meet the Spanish governor to arrange the surrender of the island and the Spanish garrison there. 2 officers, 54 Spanish infantrymen, as well as the governor general and his staff were taken prisoner and transported to the Philippines as prisoners of war. No U.S. forces were left on Guam, but the only U.S. citizen on the island, Frank Forsach, told Captain Glass that he would look after things until the U.S. forces returned.
Then they forgot him.
Huh?
And then they forgot him.
Pretty much. The Caribbean theater, of course, we're already talking about Cuba. Theodore Roosevelt would advocate for intervention in Cuba, both for the Cuban people and to promote the Monroe Doctrine. While Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he placed the Navy on a wartime footing, prepared Dewey's Atlantic Squadron for battle. He worked with Leonard Wood in convincing the Army to raise an all-volunteer regiment, the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. Wood would be given command of the regiment and was quickly became known as the Rough Riders. The Americans planned to destroy Spain's army forces in Cuba, captured the port city of Santiago de Cuba, and destroyed the Spanish Caribbean Squadron, also known as Flota de Altamar. To reach Santiago, they had to pass through the concentrated Spanish defenses in the San Juan Hills and a small town in El Caney. The American forces were aided in Cuba by the pro-independence rebels led by General Calixto Garcia. Well, for some time, the Cuban public believed that the United States government could possibly hold the key to its independence, and even annexation was considered for a time, which historian Luis Perez explored in his book, Cuba and the United States, Ties of Singular Intimacy. The Cubans harbored a great deal of discontent towards the Spanish government as a result of years of manipulation on the part of the Spanish. The prospect of getting the United States involved in a fight was considered by many Cubans to be a step in the right direction. While the Cubans were wary of the United States' intentions, the overwhelming support from the American public provided the Cubans with some peace of mind because they believed the United States was committed to helping them achieve their independence. It's funny how the Cubans thought one thing and some guys in America thought it was totally a bad thing. But, you know, when you think about things 60 years later, you have some weird ideas. Now, the first combat between the American and Spanish forces in the Caribbean occurred on May 11th, 1898, in the harbor near the city of Cienfuegos. The city was the southern terminus for the undersea communication cables that connected Cuba to Spain and other Spanish holdings in the Caribbean. The American naval officers needed to destroy these cables to cut communications into and out of Cuba in preparations for later operations against the major city of Santiago. Well, the USS Marblehead and the USS Nashville were dispatched to cut these cables early on the morning of May 11th. To cut the cables, 2 steam cutters with the crew of 8 sailors and 6 Marines each, and 2 sailing launches with a crew of 14 sailors each, maneuvered into the harbor and within 200 feet of the shore. And while these boats moved towards shore, the Marblehead and Nashville shelled the Spanish trenches dug to protect the cables from sabotage attempts. They succeeded in destroying the support buildings for the cables and drove the Spanish force back away from the beach. The boat's crews pulled one cable up and began trying to cut through the metal jacket while the Spanish soldiers started firing from cover. Marine sharpshooters would return fire from the boats, and the Marblehead and the Nashville began firing shrapnel shells in an attempt to force the Spanish completely out of the area. The sailors finished cutting one cable and pulled up the second one to begin severing it too. Spanish fire began to take a toll on the Marines and the sailors, with multiple casualties on the small boats, but the Americans were still able to cut a second wire. They began working on the third wire and succeeded in partially cutting it until the still heavy Spanish fire and mounted casualties forced the Navy officer in command, Lieutenant E.A. Anderson, to order the boats to return to the cover of the bigger vessels. In the almost 3 hours of combat, 2 men were killed, 2 mortally wounded, and 4 more seriously wounded, and they succeeded in severing 2 of the 3 cables running out of the Cienfuegos. This relatively brief fight significantly disrupted communications between Cuba, Santiago, and Spain, and contributed to an overall American goal of isolating Cuba from outside support. It also provided a major boost to American morale because it was the first combat American servicemen had seen this close to home. For their brave actions, all the Marines and sailors in the 4 small boats would receive the Medals of Honor. Now, with the first American landings in Cuba occurring on June 10th, with the landing of the 1st Marine Battalion at Fisherman's Point in Guantanamo Bay, this was followed on June 22nd to 24th when the 5th Army Corps of General William R. Shafter landed at Daiquiri in Simone, east of Santiago, establishing an operation base for the Americans. A contingent of Spanish troops, having fought the skirmish with the Americans near Simone on June 23rd, had retired to their lightly entrenched positions at Las Guidomas. An advance guard of U.S. forces under former Confederate General Joseph Wheeler ignored Cuban scouting parties and ordered them to proceed with caution. They caught up with and engaged the Spanish rearguard, about 2,000 soldiers under General Antero Rubin, who effectively ambushed them in the Battle of Las Guianas on June 24th. Now, the battle ended indecisively in favor of Spain, and the Spanish left Guianas on their planned retreat to Santiago. Now, the U.S. Army employed Civil War skirmishers at the head of the advancing columns. 3 of 4 of the U.S. soldiers who had volunteered to act as skirmishers, walking point at the head of a column, were killed, including Hamilton Fish II, the grandson of Hamilton Fish, the Secretary of State under Ulysses S. Grant, and Captain Alan K. Capron, who Theodore Roosevelt would describe as one of the finest natural leaders and soldiers he ever met. Only Oklahoma Territory Pawnee Indian Tom Isbell, wounded 7 times, survived.
Wow.
Ouchie. Well, regular Spanish troops were mostly armed with a modern, charger-loaded 7mm Spanish Mauser rifles and were using smokeless powder. These high-speed Mauser rounds were termed the Spanish Hornet by Americans because of their supersonic crack as they passed overhead. Other regular troops were armed with Remington rolling block rifles in .43 Spanish using smokeless powder and brass-jacketed bullets. U.S. regular infantry were armed with 30 to 40mm Krag Jorgensen, a bolt-action rifle with a complex magazine, Both the U.S. regular cavalry and volunteer cavalry used smokeless ammunition. In later battles, the state volunteers would use the Springfield rifle, a single-shot black powder rifle. On July the 1st, a combined force of about 15,000 American troops in regular infantry and cavalry regiments, including all four of the Army's colored Buffalo Soldier regiments and volunteer regiments, among them Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, the 71st New York, the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry, the 1st North Carolina, and the rebel Cuban forces would attack 1,270 entrenched Spaniards in the dangerous Civil War-style frontal assaults on the Battle of El Caney and the Battle of San Juan Hill outside of Santiago. More than 200 U.S. soldiers were killed and close to 1,200 wounded in the fighting, thanks to the high rate of fire the Spanish put down range of the Americans. Charles A. Wyckoff, a U.S. Army colonel who was killed in action, was the most senior U.S. Army officer killed in the Spanish-American War. Supported fire by Gatling guns was critical to the success of the assault. Cervera decided to escape Santiago 2 days later. First Lieutenant John J. Pershing, nicknamed Blackjack, oversaw the 10th Cavalry Unit during the war. Pershing and his unit fought at the Battle of San Juan Hill. Pershing was cited for his gallantry during the battle. Now, the Spanish forces at Guantanamo were so isolated by Marines and Cuban forces, they did not know that Santiago was under siege, and their forces in the northern part of the province could not break through the Cuban lines. This was not true at Moscato relief column from Montezino, which had fought its way past determined Cuban resistance, but arrived too late to participate in the siege. Well, after the battles of San Juan Hill and El Caney, the American advance halted. Spanish troops successfully defended Fort Canosa, allowing them to stabilize their line and bar the entry to Santiago. The Americans and Cubans forcibly began a bloody, straggling siege of the city. During the nights, Cuban troops dug successive series of trenches, raised parapets towards the Spanish positions. Once completed, these parapets were occupied by U.S. soldiers and used a new set of excavations, went forward, while suffering daily losses from Spanish fire, suffered far more casualties from heat exhaustion and mosquito-borne disease. At the western approaches to the city, Cuban General Calixto Garcia began to encroach in the city, causing much panic and fear of reprisals among the Spanish forces. Well, at the Battle of Tacoma, Lieutenant Carter P. Johnson of the Buffalo Soldiers, 10th Cavalry, with the experience of special operations roles as head of the 10th Cavalry, attached Apache Scouts of the Apache Wars, chose 50 soldiers from the regiment to lead deployment mission with at least 375 Cuban soldiers under the Cuban Brigadier General Emilio Nunes and other supplies to the mouth of the San Juan River east of Cienfuegos. On June the 29th, 1898, a reconnaissance team in landing boats transports from Florida and the Fontia attempted to land on the beach but were repelled by Spanish fire. A second attempt was made the next day, but again a team of reconnaissance soldiers trapped on the beach near the mouth of the Telecola River. A team of 4 soldiers saved this group and were awarded medals of honor. The USS Peoria and the recently arrived USS Helena then shelled the beach to distract the Spanish, while the Cuban deployment landed 40 miles east at Palo Alto, where they linked up with Cuban General Gomez. Now, the main port of Santiago de Cuba was the main target of naval operations during the war. The U.S. fleet would attack Santiago, needing shelter from the summer hurricane season. Guantanamo Bay, with its excellent harbor, was chosen. The 1898 invasion of Guantanamo Bay happened between the 6th and 10th of June, with the first U.S. naval attack and subsequent successful landing of U.S. Marines with naval support, where we still presently hold territory today. And the Cubans let us know about it every day. On April the 23rd, a council of senior admirals of the Spanish Navy had decided to order Admiral Pascual Cervera Topes' squadron of 4 armored cruisers and 3 torpedo boat destroyers to proceed from their present location in Cape Verde to the West Indies. In May, the fleet of Spanish Admiral Pascual Cavaras de Ponte had been spotted in Santiago Harbor by American forces where they had taken shelter for protection from sea attack. A 2-month standoff between the Spanish and American naval forces would follow. U.S. Assistant Naval Constructor Lieutenant Richmond Pearson Hobson was ordered by Rear Admiral William T. Sampson to sink the collier USS Merrimack in the harbor to bottle up the Spanish fleet. The mission, sadly, was a failure, and Hobson and his crew were captured, though Hobson soon became a national hero for leading what was widely reported as a suicide mission. Upon release, Hobson was presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor and promoted to captain. Now, the Battle of Santiago de Cuba on July the 3rd was the largest naval engagement of the Spanish-American War. When the Spanish squadron finally attempted to leave the harbor on July the 3rd, the American forces destroyed it or grounded 5 of the 6 ships. Only the Spanish vessel, the newly armored cruiser Cristobal Colon, survived, but her captain hauled down her flag and scuttled her when the Americans finally caught up with her. The 1,612 Spanish sailors who were captured and sent to Seabees Island at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard at Kittery, Maine, where they were confined at Camp Long as prisoners of war from July 11th until mid-September. The Americans treated Spanish officers, soldiers, and sailors with great respect. Ultimately, Spanish prisoners were returned to Spain with their honors of war on American ships. Admiral Cervera received different treatment from the sailors taken to Portsmouth. For a time, he was held at Annapolis, Maryland, where he was received with great enthusiasm by the people of that city. Well, as we were in the process of trying to liberate, we also ran into another enemy, yellow fever.
No.
Well, it spread quickly among the American occupation force, crippling it. A group of concerned officers in the American Army chose Theodore Roosevelt to draft a request to Washington that it withdraw the Army, a request that paralleled a similar one formed from General Schaefer, who described his force as an army of convalescents. By the time of his letter, 75% of his force was unfit for service.
Ouch.
They're getting sick.
No dear.
Well, on August the 7th, the American invasion force started to leave Cuba. The evacuation, though, was not total. The U.S. Army kept the Black 9th U.S. Cavalry Regiment in Cuba to support the occupation. The logic was that they were raised in the fact that many black volunteers came from southern states would protect them from disease. This logic led to these soldiers being nicknamed immunes. Still, when the 9th left, 73 of its 984 soldiers had contracted the disease. Now, on May 24th, 1898, a letter to Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge wrote, "Puerto Rico is not forgotten, and we mean to have it."
Ooh.
In the same month, Lieutenant Henry H. Whitney of the United States 4th Artillery was sent to Puerto Rico on a reconnaissance mission, sponsored by the Army's Bureau of Military Intelligence. He provided maps and information on the Spanish military forces to the U.S. government before the invasion. Well, the Americans' offensive would begin on May 12, 1898, with a squadron of 12 U.S. ships commanded by Rear Admiral William T. Sampson of the United States Navy, attacking the archipelago's capital, San Juan. Though the damage inflicted on the city was minimal, the Americans established a blockade in the city's harbor, San Juan Bay. On July the 22nd, the cruiser Isabel II and the destroyer Terror delivered a Spanish counterattack, but were unable to break the blockade, and the Terror was damaged. I love that name. I want a ship called Terror.
I think it might not be a horror movie.
Mm-hmm. The land offensive began on July 25th with 1,300 infantry soldiers, led by Nelson A. Miles, disembarked off the coast of Guanaca. The first organized armed opposition occurred at Yalco in what would be called the Battle of Yalco. The encounter was followed by the Battle of Ferrando. The United States seized control of the town on August 1st, but were forced to withdraw on August 5th after a group of 200 Puerto Rican Spanish soldiers, led by Pedro de Pino, gained control of the city, while most civilian inhabitants fled to a nearby lighthouse. We're hiding in the lighthouse. The Americans encountered larger opposition during the Battle of Wayback, and they advanced towards the main island's interior. They engaged in crossfire at the Guadalajara River Bridge, Cuomo, and the Sylvia Heights. Finally, at the Battle of Osamonte, the battles were inconclusive as Allied soldiers retreated. Now, battle in San Germain concluded in similar fashion, with the Spanish retreating to Lares. On August 9th, 1898, American troops who were pursuing units retreating from Como encountered heavy resistance in Amianto in a mountain known as Cerro Gravaso del Asomante and retreated after 6 of their soldiers were injured. They returned 3 days later, reinforced with artillery units, and attempted a surprise attack. In subsequent crossfire, confused soldiers reported seeing Spanish reinforcements nearby, and 5 American officers were gravely injured, which prompted a retreat order. All military actions in Puerto Rico were suspended on August the 13th after President William McKinley and French Ambassador Jules Cambron, acting on behalf of the Spanish government, signed an armistice, thereby Spanish relinquished the sovereignty over Puerto Rico. So, finally, peace would take and come out of all this chaos. With defeats in Cuba, the Philippines, fleets in both places destroyed. Spain would sue for peace, and negotiations were opened between the two parties. After the sickness and death of the British consul Edward Henry Rawson Walker, American Admiral Dewey requested the Belgian consul to Manila, Edward Andre, to take Rawson Walker's place as intermediary with the Spanish government. Hostilities again were halted on August the 12th with the signing in Washington of a protocol of peace between the United States and Spain. After 2 months of difficult negotiations, the formal peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris, was signed in Paris on December the 10th, and the United States would gain Spanish colonies of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines in the treaty, and Cuba would become a U.S. protectorate. The treaty came into force in Cuba on April 11th, 1899, with Cubans participating only as observers. Having been occupied since July 17, 1898, and thus under jurisdiction of the U.S. military government, Cuba would form its own civil government and would gain independence on May 20th, 1902. But that has been our little touch into history, our happy roll back into history for the date in April 25th in 1898, the start of the war.
Again.
Yes. But this has been the Bearded Historian. You folks have a good week, and we will see you next week.
Wow. Hour and 5 minutes. I have to find